Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. At the beginning of this year, nearly 9 in 10 adults in the United States reported feeling some form of financial stress. Now, that is a huge increase as compared to what it was in 2001, when only 17% reported the same. What is driving this massive spike in financial anxiety? Well, one of the main drivers, as is being discovered behind all of this stress, has to do with housing costs. And this is no surprise if we look at statistics about the cost of housing and rent and mortgages across the United States. 50% of renters, half of renters in our nation report being cost burdened, which means that they spend over 30% of their income on rent alone. Additionally, 70% of the younger generation, so Millennial and Gen Z, report feeling completely locked out of the housing market due to high housing costs and high interest rates. Recent homebuyers who are able to get into the market and buy a home are paying record rates in their mortgages. The costs are just sky high. And on top of that, 65% of low-income families are spending over half of their paychecks on rent alone. But the problem is not just national. Those of us who live in California know that it is exacerbated by living in this state. We lead the nation in housing-induced financial strain. And so 20% of households in our state report spending over half of their income, over 50% of their income just on housing. That is unthinkable. The idea that you would spend over 50% goes greatly against any sort of financial advice of how much you are supposed to be spending on your housing. We also have the highest median rent in the country. And listen to these numbers, because I think that while people understand that California is expensive, sometimes it can go undefined of what that really means. So our median rent is $2,895 per month. That is, again, staggering. But it doesn't end there, because we also have the highest median home price, and that sits at $904,000. And so because of that, it is no surprise that only 44% of households in our state even qualify for a mortgage at the absolute bottom tier starter home. So we're talking entry level, most basic situation that you could get. And under half of the people in our state would even qualify to be able to purchase that. And lastly, 76% of existing homeowners here in our state have legacy mortgages that have rates below 5%. And so that creates this golden handcuffs mentality where people can never sell their home, because they know if they sell their home and try to buy something different, that they will have higher rates and that will lead to higher mortgages. And so if you ever wonder, in our state, how do people live here? How do people have homes? If you drive around the neighborhood and think, how are all the people in these houses affording it? Most of them are affording it because they got in at a better time and now they are refusing to leave. So why am I blasting you with all of these statistics on today's episode? I want you to hear me when I say that if you are a Californian and you are stressed about paying your mortgage or paying your rent, if you wonder if and when you ever will be able to buy a home in our state, if you need help with a down payment because housing costs are so high that down payments are in the six figures, if you spend over half of your income on housing costs and that bothers you rightly, or if you live in a place that is simply too small for your family because you cannot afford anything greater than that, your struggles are not fake. This is a real problem, and you are not wrong if you are feeling like you are drowning and you are needing help. Housing affordability is a huge problem in California, and we must find a solution. So the question is, how can we fix it? What could we do to make it better? And this election, we have two propositions on our ballot that are being proposed as solutions to this crisis. Proposition 1 and Proposition 37 both state that they are addressing the high costs of housing and housing affordability, and that they are going to make it better. So today, we need to break them down. We need to understand what they are saying that they would do, and we need to ask the question, will this actually fix the affordability crisis in our state, or is it just proposing a Band-Aid solution to a much deeper problem? I am going to break all of it down for you today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you see the option down below to hype this episode, I would greatly appreciate it. That will just help to spread it, make this channel and this episode more discoverable to more of our fellow Californians. If you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. All right, I am so excited about our topic today because, like I said in the beginning, housing affordability is a very important issue and it's near and dear to me because, as you know, I live in our state. If you're a fellow Californian, I live here. And this is something my husband and I talk about constantly. One of our main concerns with living in California is what we're going to do for the future when it comes to housing. We even just moved and we still talk about how we just don't know how to make it work with high rents. We're concerned about the future of rents being raised even more. And when will we ever be able to afford a home here, especially if down the line we want to have kids? There's so many questions about affordability. And so if you're in the same boat, if you have those questions, if you have those concerns, I want you to know I'm in it with you. And so we need to be honest about the issues we're facing, as well as the solutions that could be proposed. So we're going to dive into it. But before we get into the propositions themselves, I want us to outline just a few criteria for how we're going to examine these propositions, because it's really easy to get into them, kind of get into the weeds and have so many thoughts in different areas about trying to respond to them. So I think it would be helpful to just outline 3 criteria that will help us keep the main thing the main thing. And that main question is, does this actually make housing more affordable for Californians? That's what we want to know, because that's the only thing that matters. If it doesn't make housing more affordable, we should not be passing it. So our 3 criteria are, first, does the proposition address the root cause of high housing costs in our state? We're going to look at things like, does this speak to housing supply? Because as I've talked about before, supply is a huge problem, and the laws of supply and demand really rule the day when it comes to prices. Are we reducing the cost of housing, or are we addressing something else? So that's going to be our first criteria. Second, who actually pays for this? Because we know a lot of times propositions are put forth and it's the taxpayers who are paying for it. And so even though it says it's making things more affordable, you're just actually going to pay more in taxes. And that's important for you to be aware of. So are the taxpayers paying for this? Are developers incurring higher costs? Is the general fund paying for this? Who actually pays? And then our third criteria, what happens 5 to 10 years from now? We want sustainable solutions. We want change that is going to be effective for the long term. Short-term fixes always feel really good. Short-term help always sounds very appealing and is easy to get voters on board, but that doesn't fix the root problem. And so we just end up with the same problems again and again and again. So lastly, we have to look at, is this going to be a long-term solution? So with that being said, let's start breaking down the details of Proposition 1. What Proposition 1 is saying that it will do is it will allow California to borrow $11.25 billion in the form of a bond to fund housing programs. And that will be broken out several different ways. The main 2 categories of how the $11.2 billion is going to be spent is $10 billion will go toward affordable housing programs, and $1.25 billion will go toward home loans for veterans in our state. Now, this does come with a cost. This would add $500 to $600 million in annual expenses to the general fund. And because it's a bond, we're paying it down over years and we're paying interest. And so it would be spread over 25 years, meaning that that is going to be a commitment in our state budget for the next quarter of a century. And then we also would be paying interest on it, meaning that the total cost of the bond would end up being 15% higher than the face value. So that's the cost that this would incur. And that is only for the $10 billion portion, because the $10 billion portion is for affordable housing. So that's coming out of the state general fund. And then the $1.25 billion that's going to veterans would be paid back, because veterans would be paying down the cost of their loan. And so that would not add an additional cost to the general fund. Now, the question that's being posed to you as a voter through this proposition is, do you want California to take on $11.25 billion in debt to expand government-funded affordable housing programs, as well as providing home loans to veterans? That's the question that you have to answer. And obviously, we have to make a lot of considerations when trying to answer that. The policy debate that then underlies this is whether borrowing this money, specifically the $10 billion that goes to affordable affordable housing, and committing the general fund to decades then of repayments is the best way for California to address its housing problems. Because like we said, we want to address the systemic problem. We want to fix the overall environment to make housing more affordable, not just continue down the path of Band-Aid solutions that aren't going to be good for the long term. So what we have to determine right now is Proposition 1 the best way to actually address the problems our state is facing? So let's go through our 3 criteria. First, what does this proposition address in terms of causes? Is it addressing the actual root cause of high housing in our state? Proposition 1 is building more housing. So if we think that the problem is supply, then I think we have to give a little bit of credit to the fact that Prop 1 is borrowing money in order to build more housing. Now, it's doing that through building housing that is affordable housing, and so we'll get into that, but it is going to develop more housing. The problem, though, which we can see very quickly, is it's not actually addressing any of the underlying problems of why it is so expensive to build housing in the first place. The reason that we have a lack of supply in California is not just because nobody wants to build houses here, it's because it's ridiculously expensive and hard and takes a very long time to do that. And so you actually start to work against yourself when you say we're going to build more housing and then we're going to make it affordable housing, because you're not giving incentives for developers or for landlords or for people who are going to rent these units out to actually want to build them, because they're not going to recoup their costs. Because affordable housing means that rent or purchasing of those units or those homes is going to be capped at a certain limit given the income of the person who is looking to occupy them. When you cap things, then we are no longer operating according to the free market. And that is the very problem that we have in California as a whole. We don't operate according to the free market. We're operating according to government controls, and that continues to jack up prices. So Proposition 1 doesn't address how long it takes for project approvals. It doesn't address all the developer fees that it is to build and develop housing here in our state. It doesn't address the cost of complying with all of our laws and regulations around building, of which there are many. And it doesn't speak to the difficulty to build in certain parts of the state. All it says is that we are going to borrow money to build houses, which we are then going to rent out at rates that are going to be lower than market value. So we can see what's happening is government is stepping in with taxpayer-funded financing, because this money is not just coming out of the air, and we'll get to that in our second criteria, but just to speak to it a little bit here, they're stepping in with taxpayer-funded financing that's going to help those certain people who are in the subsidized housing. Low-income families who get to rent from these affordable units will see a benefit because they get to rent somewhere to live. However, it is not making housing more affordable in our state. It's making it affordable for those few families, but then it is working against the overall housing environment in California. And so if the goal is to make housing so affordable that we don't need government subsidies, Proposition 1 absolutely doesn't do that. It keeps us dependent and reliant on the government stepping in to provide housing at a cheaper cost, rather than changing the environment so that housing is affordable for most people, and so that people are not reliant on government subsidies. So that's our first criteria. Criteria number 2 is who pays for this. And I already alluded to this, but this is paid for by the taxpayer, because the $10 billion that's going to be paid back with interest is taken out of the state general fund. And the general fund is funded by our tax dollars. So you and I are paying for this bond. So when you see the proposition of we're allowing the government to borrow money, you're also allowing the government to use and commit your tax dollars to paying down that debt over time for the purpose of this program. And this is a big deal because, like I said, we're committing the state budget to have to be paying for this for the next 25 years. But what have we heard continually about our state budget? We are constantly in a deficit, which means we need to bring down our spending. If your expenses outweigh your income, you need to stop spending money. And so what the government needs to do is it needs to only be funding the most essential programs possible, because it has to recognize it has a huge spending problem. But Proposition 1 doesn't do that. It is adding more programs, more and more and more, without actually addressing root causes of these problems. And so it's going to now increase the budget. We're going to increase the expenses again. What are they cutting to make it so that they can increase that without increasing our taxes? Newsflash, nothing. They're not going to cut anything because our government spending in California is absolutely out of control. And so you need to understand you're paying for this. The taxpayers are paying for this. It is not free. It is not just a nice thing. They already get so much of our tax dollars. And yet, if we pass this, we are just committing more of them to more programs. And just to be fair, there is a distinction here. The $10 billion is to the general fund. So that's taxpayer funded dollars that are going toward it. The $1.25 billion for veterans, as I said before, that is actually a loan situation where the government's borrowing money to give loans to veterans, and then the veterans are paying down those loans. So that theoretically shouldn't have a cost to the California government, and that shouldn't be a use of our taxpayer dollars. But as we see, $1.25 billion compared to $10 billion is not a significant portion. Most of the proposition, most of the spending and of the bond is going to be coming from the general fund. And so that brings us to criteria 3. What are the long-term results of a proposition like this? Unfortunately, what this is doing is this is committing us into this cycle where government is always having to step in and make up the difference between what people can afford and what the costs actually are in our state. What it needs to do is instead bring those costs down so that they're a little bit more equal. There's always going to be a difficult time, especially in a state like California where we have a high population, where it's very beautiful, where it's very attractive for people to live here. It's okay that certain areas just by supply and demand are going to be more expensive, but they shouldn't be made more expensive by bad government policy. And that's what this absolutely does. And so if you ask where we're going to be in the next 5, 10, 25 years, we're going to be right back here because nearly every election, there's a bond that says it's going to build affordable housing. So they're going to ask you for money today, and then they're going to ask you for money tomorrow, and then they're going to ask you for money in 10 years. It's never going to end. And so at some point, we have to say enough is enough. We're breaking the cycle. We want real solutions. Ultimately, the goal here should not be that in order to afford housing, you must be dependent on the government. The goal should be to make a California that is affordable enough to where people don't need a government subsidy in order to be able to pay their housing costs. Proposition 1 doesn't do that. And so ultimately, in my view, it falls short. Now, before I move on to Proposition 37, I do want to address a very quick question that you might be thinking of, or someone might pose to you, or someone might pose to me in the comments. So I just want to address it now, because the whole title and the summary of this proposition really puts the idea of helping veterans forward a lot. So it says it's affordable housing and veterans programs. And so the question that you might get, or maybe you're even wondering, is if I vote no on this, does that mean that I don't care about veterans? And the answer to that is absolutely not. I very much support our veterans, and I would be completely okay with more benefits for our veterans because of the sacrifices that they make on behalf of our country. But what's very important to realize here is that when you do the math, 88% of the bond funds in this proposition go toward affordable housing programs that are funded by the general fund, which means only 12% of the funds that are recommended here are going towards supporting veterans. We don't always get a choice. When a proposition is put in front of us, it can package a lot of things together. And you might agree with one policy choice and disagree with another policy choice, and you can't split them out. And so what I want to emphasize is that we cannot let certain sympathetic causes that are mentioned in the title of propositions or put forth very prominently in their summaries, we cannot let those completely sway us from what the main thrust of the proposition is and from the main impact that it will have on our state. So it's very easy to look at this and think, oh, but the veterans, like I like that portion. I really want to help veterans. I'm very patriotic. Like I don't want to be heartless. And then let it completely sway you. And now 88% is not going toward that one cause that you were actually voting toward. So we need to be shrewd to realize if these are good programs, they should be able to stand on their own. If veterans' home loans is a good thing that the people of California want, it should be brought separately. It should be able to stand on its own merit to be voted on and approved. But if it is lumped into other policy decisions that are bad for our state, then we have to make the wise decision to reject it entirely and realize that, again, that needs to be broken out on its own merits if it's going to be passed in our state. Proposition 1 is not the only proposition on our ballot that is speaking to housing affordability because, like I said, Proposition 37 also seeks to address this issue. What Proposition 37 does is it creates a new state program to help middle-income Californians buy their first home. The way that it does this is primarily through down payment assistance. So you might be someone who is looking to buy a home. You know that down payments are incredibly hard in California, especially if you're trying to do 20% of a down payment because houses are so expensive. And so that often is a lot of money. And so this is where the government is saying for certain groups of people in certain income thresholds, we're going to step in and we're going to help pay most of their down payment so that they can afford a home. So this proposition would approve up to $25 billion in revenue bonds. This is different from Proposition 1 because revenue bonds are paid back. So this isn't coming from the state general fund. How it would work is homeowners would be required to put 3% down of the home purchase price, and then they could be approved for up to 17% through the government state program. And so homeowners would essentially be taking on two loans. They would have their mortgage loan as usual, and then they would also have a separate loan to the state of California, which they would pay back over time. That would pay for the cost of the program. And so in theory, there's no cost to the state of California for this type of down payment assistance. So just as an example, to make this more tangible, if you wanted to purchase a $600,000 home, which is well below the median price in California, which is crazy. But if you wanted to buy a $600,000 home, you would need to provide at least 3% of the house price, which is $18,000. You could then apply for down payment assistance. And if you were approved for up to 17%, then that means California would pay $102,000 toward your down payment. You would be able to put down the 20%. You'd avoid the PMI insurance that is given if you pay less than 20% on a down payment. And then the remaining $480,000 would be financed through a traditional mortgage. Now, there are a few stipulations for who actually qualifies for this program. So it's not just anybody. You can't just say, I want to buy a house and then you get money. You have to, of course, be a California resident. That feels like it speaks for itself. You have to have a household income no more than twice the typical income for your area. So it's going to be very dependent on where you live and what the incomes are around you. You have to be purchasing a qualified new home. And generally, the house you're buying, you need to be the first purchaser of the home. So that means it's brand new homes. This is looking at new construction. And the home would have to fall under certain specified price limits. So those things are very variable depending on your income, depending where you live, depending on the housing development around you. But the idea is that it's trying to incentivize people to buy new homes, developers to build new homes that qualify for this so that they have a new pool of buyers who are going to be purchasing their homes. And then in that way, it's supposed to help affect housing supply on the back end, which we'll explain more in a minute. And that sounds great, right? That sounds great. Like if you want to buy a house and you're looking at it and you're thinking my option is to either pay $120,000 on my own or to pay $18,000 and just have an extra loan I pay to the state. Yeah, that sounds great. The state of California can absolutely pay 17% of my down payment, right? But just because it sounds very good doesn't mean that we can just shirk all of the considerations that we have to make about whether this is actually good for our state. Does helping people afford a down payment actually help make housing affordable? That's the question. And that's what we're going to answer through our criteria. So let's start with the first one. What root cause does this address? Does it actually help to create more housing supply or to lower the costs of developing in California so that we can start to bring prices down through the laws of supply and demand? Proposition 37 could potentially add new housing. How? Well, it's as I sort of alluded to in the explanation. What it wants to do is it wants to incentivize people to buy brand new homes. If you're incentivized to buy a new home, you want developers who are building those brand new homes. And so if developers are building new homes, we're adding to the housing supply. So it's sort of working through demand to then up supply. Because if a lot of Californians want a brand new house, then developers are incentivized to build new houses because they realize they're going to be purchased. So it's supposed to have the intended effect that it's going to up the housing supply while also giving purchasing power into the hands of buyers who maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to afford a brand new home. Here's the problem. Even the Legislative Analyst Office admits we have no idea if that will actually be the effect that this proposition has. So just because it's trying to increase demand for new homes, which then in theory should make developers want to build new homes, we don't actually know if that's going to be the case, and we don't know by how much that is going to be the case. What it could mean is it just has more people who now are looking for homes and have the money to potentially purchase a home, but there still aren't enough homes, which it just drives up demand without actually addressing driving up supply. And so that actually would make the problem worse. It would drive up the prices of the houses that are on the market. Because if in California you have 100 people who want to buy a home and you have 50 homes, then giving, 100 more people money to buy homes. So now there's 200 people who want to buy homes, but not actually ensuring that those 50 homes are going to increase. Now you just have 200 people looking at the same 50 homes. That's the problem. People don't want to talk about economics. Like, economics are static. Math is unchanging. It just is what it is. And so you have to abide by supply and demand. It's not fun and it's not sexy, but we have to look at the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen. And if we have low supply, we have to drive that up. This is a demand side policy, and so it's not guaranteeing that it's actually going to have that effect. Now, admittedly, this is closer to addressing the root cause of the problem than Proposition 1 was, because it's not just subsidizing housing, but it's still not addressing those same costs that I was talking about of construction costs, land costs, government fees, regulations, all of that stuff. All those things are still in place. So developers still are coming up against all of those challenges. They're just being given a bigger pool of people who might buy houses. What I would rather see is a policy that makes it easier and more cost effective for the private market to produce more housing. I, at the end of the day, don't want Californians to need a 17% loan from our government in order to buy a house. Again, I do not think that that should be the goal. So I'd rather see policies that are not making that the goal. So that's criteria 1. Criteria 2, who pays. Now, as I said, this is very different from Proposition 1 because this is not something that is going to be paid for by taxpayers. So that's good news. It wouldn't be adding more money to the state general fund. But it does not by any means mean that Proposition 37 is free. If you're a homeowner and you're a home purchaser and you're looking to be a homeowner, you would be taking on additional debt. You are not getting this money for free. You have to pay it back to the state. Now, why is that important to consider? The question becomes, is additional debt that is being given to consumers or to people who are looking to buy homes in the marketplace, is that a good trade-off for then people being able to actually afford those homes? Is giving them more money that they are just required to pay you right back over a longer period of time actually making housing affordable? So this is where we have to be really honest. Debt is still debt. And if you pay over 50% of your income for rent, and then you get in a situation where now you're just paying over 50% of your income to pay down your 2 loans, you have not been put in any more of an affordable situation. And so by making it so that people can buy homes because you're stretching their payments out longer, or you're splitting their payments between 2 different groups, or you're saying that you can just take on additional loans, that's not making it more affordable. You still can't afford the home. You can't afford it. If you could afford the home, if the prices had come down, you wouldn't need an extra loan. And so I just want us to understand this. If you take advantage of this program, if it was put in place and you took advantage of it, you pay that $18,000 you get in a home, you feel really good about it, you're still on the hook to pay for that down payment. You just didn't have to pay it at one time. This is a buy now, pay later situation. And the more debt that you take on, the more financial strain and financial stress that you will have. Debt is not a good, light, or easy thing. You absolutely should not be trying to get into more and more loans. Because again, you're not able to afford the home. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. And so you should not purchase it. Instead, California should be looking at how do we help people be able to afford the homes in our state without just giving them more money that comes from the taxpayer, or just making them take out additional debt that is still going to make them one of the 9 in 10 adults who say that they feel financial stress in our country. And then one other cost to consider with the who pays question is what happens when these borrowers default, because you are looking at people who couldn't afford that down payment on their own. And so there's some level of credit risk that's being posed. I don't believe that every single person who takes out a loan to the state of California for this down payment assistance is going to be able to pay it back in full. So if borrowers default, who is on the hook? Likely us as the taxpayer. So that's 1 and 2. Criteria 3, what's our long-term impact? What is this doing to the overall housing environment? And this is where there is a very important point that applies to both propositions that we need to understand here. The key issue of the day all boils down to this. Assistance is not affordability. The government giving you assistance, the government doing it whether because the taxpayers are funding it or because you're taking out a loan for them, is not making the environment more affordable for you. If the government gives you money toward rent, that only proves that the rent is not affordable. If the government is giving you assistance for a down payment, that proves that the down payment is not affordable because the cost of the house is not affordable. The government only has to give assistance in circumstances where things are not affordable. And so we have not addressed that main question of, are these propositions going to make housing more affordable in the state of California? No, they're Band-Aids that are trying to bridge the gap between what people can afford and what the actual prices are. And so government assistance is not affordability. We need to be thinking bigger. We can't just keep addressing symptoms that are flaring up because people can't afford to live here. We need to address causes. We need to address the root illness that is happening that is causing all of these symptoms. That means that we shouldn't build a permanent system where Californians are reliant on government assistance just to be able to pay their most basic costs. Assistance only helps someone to survive in a system that is already unaffordable, but it is not making that system more affordable. And it's not looking at all of the restrictions, the regulations, the burdens, the costs, the fees, the taxes that were imposed in the first place to get us to this place where housing is just skyrocketed in prices. So any sort of solution that addresses those things, that's the long-term solution that I am looking for. These propositions, though, are not that. At the end of the day, Californians, you and me, absolutely deserve more than policies that just make an impossible situation manageable. We should not just be trying to stay afloat. We should be ambitious enough as a state. Our government should be ambitious enough to pursue real solutions that give families, that give you, that give me a genuine path toward stability, toward ownership in our state, and toward financial independence so that we do not have so much financial strain, anxiety, and worry in the state of California. These propositions are only offering temporary relief to certain groups of individuals who live in our state. But we should not ever confuse that with actually building a system that works in the first place or making the overall structure of housing in our state more affordable to begin with. We can and we should do better, which means that come November, we absolutely must vote no on Propositions 1 and 37. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you feel a little bit more prepared to face the upcoming election in November. If you love the show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.